Welcome, everyone, as we await for folks to enter into Zoom. Please, if you wouldn't mind, type your name and location in the chat box. We'll get started in just a minute. We're covering the map. Great to see. Good morning if you're just entering. Good afternoon for those in Eastern time zone. Please enter your name and location in the chat box, and we're about to start our panel discussion in just a moment. Good morning, everyone. My name is Shawn Healy. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy for the Civics Now Coalition, which is a project of iCivics. And I want to say a few words of introduction before we actually ask to hear from you right off the top. We have a poll queued up for you. But this is a panel called What It Takes. And specifically, we have a panel of state legislators who have had success in pushing bipartisan K-12 civic education policies in their respective states. And it's fair to say, if we look at the current climate, to crib from Charles Dickens in the Tale of Two Cities, this is both the best of times and the worst of times with respect to K-12 civics policies. Yesterday, we heard from Representative Rosa DeLauro, talked about really transformational legislation in Congress, the bipartisan, bicameral Civic Secures Democracy Act, which would make a generational investment in K-12 civics, much of that money flowing to states and districts, and really signaling federal prioritization of this issue. You also may have seen just last Friday on Constitution Day, another bipartisan bill was introduced in the House. It's called the Teaching Engaged Citizenship Act, which would also make a significant investment in civic education and service learning at the state level and in educational nonprofits. So real leadership on this issue in Washington. As part of our work at the Civics Now Coalition, we have a table where we have a state policy task force. As part of that work, we've tracked state legislation. This spring, we were following 88 different bills in 34 different state legislatures. And of course, not all of those bills got across the finish line, but some major wins in a handful of states. Indiana and New Jersey specifically passed middle school course requirements. I'll speak more about Indiana in a bit. And Oregon and Rhode Island got high school course requirements across the finish line. The Rhode Island bill actually has a project-based component to the course also. And then additional progress in a number of other states like Colorado, which strengthened its civics course requirement, Utah, which put an experiential civics pilot in place, a local pilot of experiential learning in civics, and Virginia, which actually made it possible for students to have an excused absence for civic engagement activities. So those are some of the highlights. The other thing that happened this year is civics entered the culture war, which many of you are all too well aware of. There have been a wave of bills, executive orders, actions by state education agencies to restrict how we teach about race and racism and bias. 28 states by Chalkbeat's count, 12 of those states actually have those policies have the effect of law at this point. On the other side of this, once again, tale of two cities or tale of two years, 15 states have actually taken action to expand education on racism, bias, and the contribution of specific racial and ethnic groups. Definitely two sides of the coin. The good news, kind of bring this all back together, is there is broad public support for stronger civic education policies. Yesterday, there was a reference to the Frank Luntz study that Luis DeBay said in the opening remarks, which showed that more than any other reform, stronger K-12 civic education rose to the fore when Americans, and specifically registered voters, were asked last year what could help solve some of the problems that plague our democracy. Republicans and Democrats alike, actually 56% of both, identified civics as the top issue. There was no other issue even close, and no other issue that received bipartisan support. And then most recently, the Heritage Foundation over the summer released their own polling data, and they showed overwhelming support from both parents and teachers for both more focus on civic education and more instructional time, particularly when it comes to high school. And of course, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank in Washington. So gathered here today, we have representation from 4 different states. I'm going to introduce the panelists in just a bit, but the 4 states represented here have made significant progress on civic education. Georgia, for example, had a bill this session, Senate Bill 220, called the Georgia Civics Renewal Act, which is still making its way through the Georgia legislature. Representative Gambill will speak to that in a bit. Illinois has made significant progress over the last decade on civic education, requiring in 2015 a high school civics course, and then more recently in 2019, a middle school civics course. Indiana had the big win, as I referenced earlier, House Bill 1384, which among many things required a semester of civics in middle school, but also set up a permanent commission on civic education in the state and asked the state to revisit its civic standards. And last but certainly not least, Massachusetts passed a landmark 2018 law that both revised civic standards, put in place a project-based civics requirement for middle school and high school, also put in place a high school voter challenge by district, and also created a project trust fund, which accepts both private and public support to support implementation of this important law. So those are the states represented here today. You can see why they've made some tremendous progress. And with that, I'd like to queue up the poll. So the first question, do you or your state have plans to propose a bill in the next legislative session? And second, if yes, what elements will the bill include or should the bill include? And these elements draw from our state policy menu, which we just released a revised edition of this week. Pause for a moment for you to answer those poll questions. As you finish the poll, if those of you that have your camera on, if you wouldn't mind, give me a thumbs up before I start moving on. Looks like we've made some progress on the poll. Excellent. I'll share the results in just a moment. But as you're finishing up the poll, I wanted to introduce the panelists that have joined us today. I want to start with my good friend Chuck Dunlap, who is the president and CEO of the Indiana Bar Foundation. I encourage you to read the bios of all the panelists and checking our event program, but you'll have an opportunity to hear much more from Chuck and the good work that he's done in Indiana. Second, joined by Representative Matthew Gambill, who's a Republican representing Georgia's 15th district, Centerville, Georgia, hopefully I'm saying that right, which is a city north of Atlanta. Also elated to be joined by Representative Andy Vargas, who's a Democrat representing Massachusetts' 3rd district, from Haverhill, Massachusetts, which is north of Boston, just about on the New Hampshire border. And last but certainly not least, the senator from my home state, Elgie Sims Jr., who's a Democrat representing Illinois' 17th district, which represents the south side of Chicago. He's from the Chatham neighborhood, but also extends into the south suburbs. And do we have polling results that I can share before we hop into the questions? Okay, well, while we await the results, I want to hop into our program. And specifically, let's dive right into a few questions that I'd like each of you to weigh in on. And specifically, it starts with a place that I think all of the states have contemplated or are in the process of contemplating, which is what is the role of state task force, state commissions with respect to civic education. And I'm going to start with my friend Chuck, because the Indiana Bar Foundation just a year ago put one of these together and yielded, I think, some pretty significant results. So Chuck, why is a task force, why is a state commission so important to strengthening K-12 civics policies?
Thanks, Shawn, and happy to be here. And I do want to also send my regards out to Representative Tony Cook. I'm sort of pinch hitting. He was a crucial supporter and really a big promoter for this happening in Indiana. So as far as the actual task force, we at the Indiana Bar Foundation have been involved in civic education for a long time. We created a task force starting in 2020, because 2020 was going to be like every other year. So we thought it was a great time to have a task force to talk about civic education. And despite the headwinds of pivoting and everything else like everybody else had to do as well, it was really crucial. And let me also say, in IndyCar country, we have to recognize our sponsors, and I'm sure in NASCAR country as well. The Lumina Foundation was a crucial supporter for us being able to put this task force together. We were led by our Lieutenant Governor, and we had representation from all caucuses, the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, which was really crucial to this process as well as a lot of other. We had business leaders, we had a Chief Justice, we had Lee Hamilton, who I'm sure many of you know has been involved in this for a long career, and we were thrilled to have him involved. So it really was important to have that happen. And because of that, it was a term limited time. So we were focused on getting things and getting a recommendation by the end of 2020, which we did. One of the recommendations was, and then the legislation that followed we have a short legislative session in the first part of this year that we got this accomplished in, was to create a permanent commission. And that was part of the legislation that we were fortunate to have passed. So we're pivoting from a part-term or a term-limited task force into a full commission, which is modeled after our task force, but we'll have gubernatorial appointments and some other folks on it as well. So we're hoping to continue the efforts now that we have a permanent task force and commission, gotta get my terminology right, in place. And so I think, again, that was crucial to us getting where we are. And I think it's really going to be crucial to us getting on the many next steps that we have to do as well.
Thanks, Chuck. And yeah, wonderful job. I think Indiana is such a model for the country and how to do this well. And yeah, the results speak for themselves. I think they had one no vote on this bill that made its way through the legislature. Representative Gambill, you're a sponsor of legislation that would do something similar in Georgia. And I know, I think the clock just ran out this spring, but I know you and the Randall Trammell and the Georgia Center for Civic Engagement are still at work standing up this commission in Georgia. Can you speak a bit about its importance and what you're trying to do?
Absolutely. Thank you, Shawn, for the opportunity to participate today, and all the folks at iCivics who were involved in planning this. It's an honor. We had the Georgia Civics Renewal Act in the form of House Bill 589 and its companion legislation, which was Senate Bill 220. I introduced the House bill. My colleague in the Senate, Senator, introduced the Senate bill with the hopes that one or the other would at least pass, and then ultimately make it to the governor's desk. And we are in a carryover year. We have a 2-year term, so we're going to have both of these bills still eligible for consideration when we begin our legislative session in January of 2022. But it basically establishes a commission, if you will, of 17 members who represent various backgrounds from the minority and the majority caucus, a justice from the Supreme Court, the Attorney General, the Georgia Chamber, the Metro Atlanta Chamber, the state school superintendent, 2 civics teachers, the Association for County Commissioners of Georgia, the Georgia Municipal Association, and most importantly, the Georgia Center for Civic Engagement, which is headed by my friend, Dr. Randall Trammell. And of course, the being there is to make recommendations on how we improve civics education and its deployment in our school systems throughout the state of Georgia.
Wonderful, thank you. And Senator Sims, I wanted to point to you in particular. I came to know you through your work on the Council of State Governments in the Midwest, and you champion a number of issues, but this one in particular. Yeah, would love to speak for this. I know you even made it the focus of the summer conference you did in pre-pandemic times, but an issue that you championed in our state of Illinois, but then across the Midwest.
Yeah, Shawn, first, let me thank you, Shawn, for your work in this area, and everybody on the iCivics team for being advocates in this area. This has long been an area that, as Shawn mentioned, I've championed. When I was chair of the Council of State Governments Midwestern Legislative Conference, it was my chair's initiative. Now I come to this work, as a longtime advocate for youth and youth involvement, and I do a significant amount of mentoring in my district and beyond. And some of the work that I've done in the civics area comes from some of that work and some of the discussions I've had directly with young people about their interaction with government and their interaction with what government does and what it does not do on their behalf. That's why one of the pieces of legislation I was very proud to sponsor, which eventually became law, was Senate Bill 1970, which allowed for young people who are eligible to vote, but they are students, to have ample time during school hours with pre-approved times to be able to exercise their franchise. That came from discussions with young people where they were saying, if they were caregivers for their young siblings and they had after school activities, et cetera, they were being essentially disenfranchised, but they wanted to be able to participate in their government. And that's really what this is all about. We starting, and we've now had and Shawn mentioned, and I've got to thank him for the work that he has done in bringing these issues up. In 2015, we passed a law here in Illinois that would allow for high school students, there be a requirement for civics education in high schools. We backed that up in 2019 with passing a law that would allow for civics education in elementary school, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, because we want young people to understand their government. We don't want you to, when you start to be able to vote, to have to learn to be an educated voter. We want people to understand. I think you saw that, you referenced those numbers when you talked about the poll that you did, where both Democrats and Republicans both agree that if we understand our government, we can truly move our government forward. And that's really what this is all about, making sure that we engage our young people, we engage them at a time where we're creating these informed voters, so that we're not voting based on what emotion, or we're not voting based on what someone has said, but we're giving them the opportunity to be real educated voters to improve our democracy. That's really what this is all about.
I appreciate you saying that, Senator Sims. I always say that elections are teachable moments, and in Illinois, it's part of our school code that we have to teach about methods of voting and elections. So it's important that we weave that into a civic education. Frankly, it's a reason that secretaries of state have been such great partners in civics. Representative Vargas, certainly we did a task force in Illinois, and we actually looked to Massachusetts, which had done one prior to us, and was one of the models that we looked at for what we did. But I was particularly heartened as I prepared for today's conversation, when I read your bio. The top issue that you emphasized on your profile was the success of the 2018 law in transforming civic education in Massachusetts. and would love to hear the story about how you made that happen.
Sure. Thank you, Shawn, and thank you to iCivics and everyone who's participating here today. I first got involved in civics education when I was 16 years old in high school. I was a part of a statewide coalition called Teens Leading the Way. That was 12 years ago now. Believe it or not, it's been that long. I can't have a drink. I'm older than 21. Somebody joked around and asked me if I could have a drink on a Zoom earlier today. So I got involved in high school on civics education because as young people, we asked ourselves, what was the most important issue area for us to work on at the State House at the time? And we kicked around ideas from, gun violence, climate change, police community relations. But ultimately, we settled on the fact that no matter how passionate we were about all those issues, unless we had an informed and engaged electorate, an informed, engaged society that knew how to participate meaningfully in our democratic process, then it didn't matter how passionate we were about those issues. And so we picked civics and we filed legislation, and that brought me to the State House for the first time. So the campaign in itself was a civics project for me in high school. And I was introduced to the State House. And I'll be honest, as a young person, I came to the State House pretty cynical, thinking, oh, these politicians just want to take pictures with us teenagers. But I walked away completely blown away that we could have Democrats and Republicans working together on this issue. We had 48 co-sponsors on that bill, bipartisan support. We testified before the Education Committee with a hip hop video. I think it was the first hip hop video that was submitted to testimony. And I was hooked, right? The bill didn't pass that session, but we kept the issue going. And when I was 24 years old, I joined the legislature after serving on the city council for 2 years. And by then it had been 8 years since I had been working on civics. And I went to my now colleagues who were there when I was 16. And I said, guys, I'm a colleague now. Can we get this done, please? Like, now's the perfect time. And just the combination of momentum inside the building, but also those stakeholders outside of the building saying, look, we really need to take care of our democracy. We have to find a way to get this done and put an emphasis on this. And also ensure that school districts get the resources that they need, the professional development that they need, and that we do civics education the right way, not just asking students to recite the preamble or to memorize the Bill of Rights, but to actually embed them into projects like one that I had when I was in high school that brought me to the State House to testify on a bill. And so I always tell people that it took us 8 years to pass that bill, and I was literally in high school and then became a state rep, and that's when we passed it. And so it takes time sometimes, but you can't give up and you have to build consensus among stakeholders who are your allies.
Wonderful. It's amazing to hear that story. And I often like to say the best civics lessons of my life have been working on civics, advocating for civics. And so grateful that you landed in the state legislature and really passed a model bill for emulation across the country, Representative Vargas. I want to come back to you quickly, Senator Sims. I mentioned at the top this national debate about how we teach about race and ethnicity and the diverse history of the country. And Illinois has led on this, right? This session passed legislation that required the teaching of Asian American history. I believe we were the first state to do that. And I know you play a big role in the Black Caucus that moved legislation, I believe, late last year, early this year, a number of different planks, but there was an education plank. And I think there's some specific focus on how we teach Black history in this state. So would love to hear your comments and your thoughts about equity, specifically and how we teach about civics. So we've passed broad policies in Illinois, right, that, as you said, require a semester in both high school and middle school. But how do we center equity in this work?
Absolutely. Shawn, I think I'll start the question or start my answer with a story. So as I mentioned, I do a significant amount of mentoring. And one of with the mentors and I have an internship or a very robust internship program. And if you are going to intern in my office, one of the requirements that you're going to leave with is knowledge. You're not just going to make copies and answer the phone when you work in my office. You're going to, as Representative Vargas just talked about, you're going to have to engage in policy discussions. So I had one of my interns recently I come through and I like to get engaged with them. And I was having this conversation with this young man. And I also, in addition to meeting with my interns, I like to talk to their parents. So I had a conversation with both the young man and the parent, and the young man's mother said to me, would you talk to him about his history grades? Everything else is great. His history grades are horrible. Would you talk to him about it? I said, absolutely, I'll talk to him about it. So I had a conversation with the young man. I said, okay, what's going on with history? He said, Senator, math is universal. You know, it makes sense to me. You know, 1 plus 1 is always going to equal 2. But I don't see myself reflected in history. There is a narrative that's been created that the contributions of my ancestors didn't matter. And when you come to that reality, the reason we have this disconnect going on in our public discourse right now is because there's this disconnect. There's this narrative that's been created that there are some in our community did not fully contribute to the American experience, which is just not accurate. So we are teaching a history which is incomplete. That's why when we have these discussions, we have to have discussions that they are sometimes uncomfortable. You know, as you mentioned, we passed the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus led a legislative initiative here earlier this year, focused on four pillars: education, healthcare, economics, and criminal justice. I like to say that if you fail in those first 3, they all lead to the criminal justice system. So you've got to get them all right. And when we've had these discussions about how we don't adequately educate our young people, we're forcing them to out of the educational system and into the school to prison pipeline, which is what we have seen so often. So that's why when we're having these discussions about creating an educational system which reflects all of our history, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, all of us, when you're teaching civic and education which accurately reflects all of the contributions, you have a full picture of what the American experience looks like. So that's why we were so proud to pass that legislation as a legislative Black caucus. And I was so proud that my colleagues stood with us as we start to have these sometimes challenging discussions, because it challenges who and what we've been led to believe all of our lives. But it's necessary if we're going to move forward in this great American experience.
Thank you, and thank you for your leadership once again on this issue, Senator Sims. Representative Gambill, Georgia seemingly is at the center of the political universe these days, right? And partly because the state is so competitive politically, so contested politically. I know the bill that you were working on this session drew broad bipartisan support. How do we do that? We've had success in other states, right, along those lines. But how do you do that in such a hotly contested state like Georgia? How do you build broad bipartisan support for civics?
Right. Well, even before, going back before the most recent election cycle, it was apparent that our method and system for delivering civics education here in our state was in existence. And certainly there's a lot of wonderful teachers that have been in this space. But it's apparent to all of the legislators, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican or an independent, that the majority of our constituents that we interact don't have a basic understanding of the system of government that we have, not only at the local, but the state and definitely at the federal level. And so it was a no-brainer for me when I started working with Dr. Trammell and the Center for Civic Engagement that we need to step it up. And of course, the most recent election is, a great reminder that we have processes and procedures in place that have to be followed, and that no one just goes out and arbitrarily makes decisions in a vacuum by themselves. So that's a big part of the push for this, is to look at what do we currently have in place from a civics education standpoint, and then how do we enhance that conversation for students so that we're catching more students and that we're being able to educate them more effectively as it relates to this.
Thank you, and thanks again for your leadership on this issue. Chuck, the Hoosier State is the apple of our eye right now. in that you passed landmark civic legislation in one of the more difficult political environments I can ever remember. And Indiana's a red state, right? So you're not actually all that competitive, at least at an aggregate level. But you got this legislation through with a single no vote. How do you do that? How can other states, and particularly red states, right? So there are 24 states out there that have unified Republican control. There are 8 other states that have Republican legislatures. What can they learn from what happened in Indiana this spring?
Well, a couple things that we had, and Representative Gambill actually, I think, referred to one of them. We had a receptive audience with the state legislature because they hear those same things. You know, they're asked about how things are going in Washington, D.C. Well, we're not in Washington, D.C., or, you know, I have this pothole, or, you know, some other local government issue. So they understand in a real way what the need for civic education is, because they're seeing it in how they interact with their constituents and others. So that's one thing. And again, that's nonpartisan. They see that across the board. The other part is when we did our task force. So as we're building up to the legislative session that we had earlier this year. So in 2020, we had our task force. We conducted some polling and some data, and we heard from the teachers themselves. And again, it was no surprise for many of us that are involved in this area, in this arena. The teachers, they believe in civic education. They need more resources for civic education. And one of those is time in the classroom. And it's particularly, you know, if you have a dedicated class, obviously in high school, we did in middle school. And then in the elementary school level, there's a whole level of competition for limited time. And so we heard from a lot of teachers and other academics and administrators who sort of reinforced that, which is how we ended up getting to our specific legislation is you know, sort of carving out. Nobody likes mandates, at least in our state. Typically, that's usually a word that people aren't too excited about. But the idea of having a requirement to have civics was met with, you know, a lot of support. Obviously, we have 150 legislators, and we had 149 yes votes throughout the whole process. So I think that's certainly a good way to get through the legislative process in a good place.
Yeah, hats off to you. And I know you mentioned Representative Cook earlier. I think it helped. He was a social studies teacher, right, when he started. So in a school administrator. So I think you know, having a ringer on the inside was critical. But yeah, the lieutenant governor chaired your task force, which I think also added some heft and some prominence to the work that you were all doing. So Civics now is a coalition, right? We have 172 organizational members. We have a state table that Chuck sits at, where we have 36 states represented there. And what we're trying to do in our respective states is to build coalitions. Some are mature. Representative Vargas in Massachusetts, I'm sure you're thoroughly intertwined with the Massachusetts Civic Learning Coalition. Others are just getting off the ground. But what role, I'm asking this of each of you, but I'd like to start with you, Representative Vargas. What role do coalitions play in advocating for an issue like civics, and what do you as a legislator need from coalitions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a central piece of the legislative making process. I think as legislators, we always look for consensus, right? We're always looking for what do each of the stakeholders that are going to be affected by this particular piece of legislation think about the legislation before us. And so it's really the role of the coalition to figure out all those details, to have difficult conversations, to have the mandate conversation, to have the resource conversation, and to make sure that you're coming up with some consensus that then allows us as legislators to move that bill forward, having the confidence to say, we've checked in with all these stakeholders, they feel good about what's in front of us, and that really ups the chances of legislation moving forward. If you don't have that consensus, it makes it that much easier to derail a bill through the legislative process.
Excellent, thank you. Senator Sims, what role do coalitions play? What do you need what do you need from coalitions as we try to advance this work, both in Illinois, but across the map?
Absolutely, I'd agree with my colleague. I think they're critical. Having coalitions be part of the process. It really helps when, as we're trying to have those difficult conversations, when you have someone who's on the fence. If you have, as you talk about the experience in Indiana, having an educator who can talk about their lived experience, be part of those discussions, it makes it adds a certain level of credibility. Similar to if you have an instance where you have parents who are involved in issues that are going to affect their children, or school professionals, having advocates be part of the process is critically important to having it be successful. But also having you take the not just be involved, but be involved at the ground floor. And I'll go back to the passage of the Safety Act that we passed that we talked about earlier. This was one of the most comprehensive, broad-based piece of legislation in criminal justice reform measures that not only the state of Illinois has ever seen, but the country's ever seen, because we had advocates who were at the table actively involved in the negotiations. They were activists and advocates, victims' rights advocates, domestic violence advocates who were at the table actively negotiating with members of law enforcement, actively negotiating with members of the legislature, making sure that all voices were heard. And that's why when you got to the end, even though those discussions were difficult, no one could say they were left out. And that's when you don't have the ability to have a piece of legislation be derailed. You don't have the ability to have, you're able to get progress made, even though it's difficult. You're able to get progress made. I've talked about, oftentimes, trying to get large piece of legislation together, and you have advocates and activists at the table, but when they can't agree, it makes it much more difficult. So when you have advocates who are actively participating, it makes a success. It allows for the possibility and probability of success to go up tremendously.
Thanks, Senator Sims. Representative Gambill, you're on the board of the Georgia Center for Civic Engagement. What role does the center and its constituents play in advocating for stronger civic education in your state?
They do a fabulous job, and the individuals that serve on the board along with me come from just a diverse background, and that really helps in our conversation as we keep the focus on civics education and how to improve that here in the state. As far as building coalitions outside of the center, working with the chambers of commerce and the municipal associations, the county commissioners associations, and then our constituents too. Advocacy, like I like to tell a lot of groups, is a crock pot and not a microwave, and it takes time. Unfortunately, people are very impatient, and thanks to social media and technology, we've all been driven in that direction. But building coalitions is extremely important because you get people on the same page, and it helps to move legislation through the process. And so it's so fundamental to what our work here in Georgia and where we're trying to head to pass our legislation in the upcoming legislative session.
Thank you. Thanks for your service on that organization. The Georgia Center is our state affiliate from the state. So grateful for your leadership on that. One of my final question before we actually turn to some questions appropriately from students, I'm going to start with Chuck and then ask others to weigh in. Chuck, you lead the Indiana Bar Foundation, and you run a program of the Center for Civic Education called We the People, and certainly centers young people's voice in the political process. They learn by doing, right? They do mock congressional hearings. My question to you, and frankly to the whole group, is what is the role for students in advocating for stronger civic education?
Yeah, it's a great question and a really important role. And I think students don't always understand or feel the empowerment that they have. And I'll just give you an example of our process, because there was somebody who actually I think you may hear from in some regard during the question part, but Helen McKinney is her name, and she is I think a junior now in high school, and she is pursuing her Gold Award with the Girl Scouts in civics. She did the We the People program. She's been very involved, and she came to testify in the House and the Senate, took time to come and do that. And I was glad that I was before her, because I would not have wanted to testify after her, because she blew everybody away. Her passion, her eloquence, the fact that she took time to come down to talk to the state legislators about the importance of civic education. And it was something to sort of behold. But there was a bunch of other people in that room testifying, but she caused, she was something different. She was a youth perspective, somebody who cared, who was passionate, and that really got their attention. And so it was great to have that sort of advocacy. And I think just youth, the other thing is I come from a law school background and a legal background. And so you look at issues from different perspectives, and a lot of the We the People curriculum kind of does that too. And so having youth perspective, first of all, understand the policies, understand what's out there, look at all facets of it, all sides. And we need people who can make change. I think youth are particularly situated to do that. So I think it can be a really powerful thing if you identify a role for them, and they can identify for themselves as well and follow their passions.
This up to the other panelists, other thoughts on the role that young people, that students can play in advocating for stronger civics.
I'll jump in here. I mean, look, throughout our nation's history, young people have been behind some of the most important movements. And I think civics has to be right in line with that. They are probably the most important stakeholder in advocating for civics education legislation. So if you're a young person out there thinking about, how do I get engaged? Should I get engaged? The answer is yes. You're the person who's most affected probably by this legislation. And we need the people most affected by any bill to be the ones that are most active on them.
Listen, my young people are my lifeline in a lot of ways, generationally and just from perspective. And so when I'm around them and I'm able to see them participating in civics education, of course, in redoing the legislative process, reenacting that through their activities through the Georgia Center on Civic Engagement, I mean, it's encouraging to me, and I get to hear them talk about the issues. And it helps to provoke thought with me, because I certainly don't know everything, and so I depend on it. But I realize my time is now, and I've been given this opportunity to serve now. But hopefully, they will step into this role, and if we're not working to encourage that and foster that, then shame on us. And so that's also what I love about participating in this is that you get that opportunity to leave a longer lasting impact than just your immediate service of what I'm doing today in this role.
Let me add on to Representative Gambill's point there. My grandfather said it a different way. He said, the things that you do for yourself, they die with you, but the things you do for others, they live on. That's your legacy. And that's essentially what we're doing here. And having our young people be a part of this discussion, leadership and service, it's a relay race. It's not a sprint. You run your leg of the race, you pass the baton to the next generation. So the next generation, they are going to seize this mantle of leadership and this legacy of leadership, and they're going to be the ones who improve upon what we are doing right now. So they are the stakeholders that we're fighting for. They're the stakeholders that we're trying to make sure we leave a legacy for. So they played the most important role. That's I'm always so proud of the young people I come into contact with, and some of the work that the interns that I had this past summer that they did on a legislative front. It rivaled legislative development that some of the college students that I've run into, and some of the recent college grads I've run into. We had everything from environmental justice to mentoring programs to mental health services, economic development, animal cruelty legislation. There was some really innovative, thought-provoking pieces of legislation that those young people produced. But they've got to have the chance. They've got to have the ability to be a part of this process, and that's why I think it's critically important that we get them involved so they understand and they have the ability to showcase these skills before they put them to practice on a daily basis.
Thank you, Senator Simpson. Thanks to each of you. So I'm going to ask our producers to queue up. We have a few student questions that Chuck alluded to, but the polling results, and you can actually see them if you just click on the polls tab, looks like a plurality of respondents suggests that states have plans to propose a bill on civics in the next session. Next response was maybe. Only 17% said no, so that's encouraging. And then the subject of the legislation kind of across all over the place, but course and time requirements, I think, earned the most support at 26%, followed by teacher professional development, state learning standards, youth voice, equity actually was above youth voice. So those are some that rose to the fore. But with that, I believe we have some questions queued up. So let's hear the first.
Hello, my name is Helen McKinney and I'm in 11th grade. I go to school in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm passionate about civic learning because I want to make sure everyone in my community and in communities across the United States can participate in our democracy. My question for the panel is, what do you see as the role of media literacy in civic education?
Media literacy and civic education, I should say, as you guys think about your answer, want to give a shout out. If you tuned in yesterday, you saw Judith Batty, the CEO of the Girl Scouts, but the Girl Scouts have been phenomenal partners in this work in advocating for stronger civics and have a civic engagement badge. How cool is that? So media literacy, what do you think, guys?
I think I'll jump in. You know, we've all. I was looking around for my phone to make a point, but you know, we've all become attached to our phones, and we live in this 24-hour news cycle. But I think that we have started to get news from a number of different sources. So I think, from my perspective, and I have this conversation. I've got a junior in high school right now, so I've got a junior and a 7th grader. So I'm constantly having these discussions with them about the difference between what's been presented on social media versus what's actual news, and the ability to distinguish between the two, and figuring out and finding out for yourself, not living by and listening to someone else's perspective to understand a position. So I will often, if my kids were sitting here, they would probably say they get tired of me saying defend that. You know, as Chuck mentioned, I'm a lawyer too by trade. So, so when my kids make a blanket statement, I'll say, well, explain that or defend that. And, I guess that's part of that Socratic training that we get. But so too often times we've got because we are in this 24-hour news cycle, we can get our news and get perspective from social media and television and all these other different places. We get lost in what is accurate, but it takes a little more work for us to make ourselves literate on what is true and what's not.
And if I could just jump in and on Senator Sims's point, I teach a class at Indiana University. They're mostly freshmen and sophomores, and one of the things I pull is, where do you get your information? It's not the same place I get my information a lot of times, and I end up using some primary sources, like, let's literally read the Constitution, and here are some things, and sometimes it's the first time they've done some of that, and so that's a process too, as far as not all source material is the same, and you have to have an understanding of it. The challenge is, I'm old enough too. Without social media and everything, you have bombarded with so many different things. It's hard to make sure you understand that they're not all equal. So that's a challenge.
Well, I think just from an influence standpoint, and look, we all have a love-hate relationship with the media, but as it relates to this issue being something that most everyone can get behind and support, they play a powerful role in influencing people across our state and in our communities about their thoughts on this and our work in this. And so when we were in the middle of trying to get our bill passed earlier this year, they were a great influence in both the social media side and the mainstream media side, pushing out information about our bill and letting people know that it was active. And then, of course, people started asking questions and emailing, and that's good from an educational standpoint. So In that regards, they did play an important role in helping to get information out about what we're working on in Georgia and raise the awareness for the need for more support for civics education in our state.
Can I ask my colleagues to queue up another question, but as they do that, point back to our state policy menu, which does have a section on media literacy. And we really cribbed on, my colleagues might be able to put this in the chat too. Democracy Ready New York put out an excellent report on raising digital citizens, which is, I think, what the panelists are certainly referring to, and really thinking about a unified approach to media literacy across subject areas. So in my world, every teacher should be a civics teacher, and media literacy as a component in every subject area. So states taking a unified approach, particularly through standards, is a recommendation that we make in that policy menu. We say a lot more there, so please check that out. Next question, please.
Hello, my name is Pranitha Polavarpu, and I'm a freshman at University of Rochester in New York. I want to encourage civic learning because education leads to active involvement and change. Being a major global influence, the U.S. and its civilians should know the effects of their votes and their decisions on developing countries around the world. If we improve public awareness on global humanitarian crises and wars, we can motivate more young people to vote and learn about our democratic processes. Students should be taught about the effects of our policies on other countries and relevant current events, like the Yemen war or what's currently going on in Afghanistan right now. It is not only a responsibility of an American civilian, but a global citizen to be aware of our country's actions on others. After implementing my lesson plan on global crises into the local school curriculum, many students stated that this knowledge inspired them to create change and participate more in government. Therefore, civic learning creates future leaders. My question for the panel: each of your states passed laws in recent years to strengthen civic education in schools. From your perspective, what work remains to ensure students graduate prepared for informed and lifelong participation in our constitutional democracy?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick. So in terms of next steps in Massachusetts, there's a couple of things that we're looking at. My office had a couple of fellows look into what the results were of that 2018 bill. Obviously, we hit a pandemic, so it was tough to kind of get a good measurement of the impact. But I always like to say an unexamined law is not worth passing. So we examined it, and we found some key themes that are important for us to build on. And one of them was that the districts that did the best at implementing the bill actually had at least one person who owned civics in the district. In other words, there was an administrator, there was a department lead, there was a teacher that took it upon themselves to make civics their thing. And for the districts that kind of were around the edges trying to implement the bill, there wasn't one person who had identified civics as their baby, right? And so one of the things that we want to do in the legislation that we filed this session is to ensure that every single district has at least one person who owns civics. Who's going to be responsible for implementing the bill? How are they tracking the projects that we're asking them to offer students? That's a key component of what we found in our legislation. We also found that the funding that we provided through the Civics Project Trust Fund was being distributed in a manner that perhaps was helpful for some districts, but not so helpful for others, in that the state was putting together multiple school districts together for a $50,000 grant for professional development. When what we heard from teachers and administrators in our research was, we just need a stipend so that someone can actually own civics and make it a part of their formal job, right? And so can we have some of that trust fund funding instead go towards making somebody feel that this is their responsibility, they're taking this on, and they're going to get compensated for that. And then lastly, we also found that both students, teachers, and administrators thought that it could be helpful to have a badge or a civic seal that schools or districts could apply for to get on their statewide profile, so that perhaps there wasn't another mandate on another subject area, but something that every single school or administration could reach for, right? There's a lot of conversations around testing and accountability, and that we don't want to put more testing and accountability measures on certain schools and districts, but a badge would allow schools to apply and aspire to reach a civic standard of excellence. And so those are some of the things that we're doing to build on top of the 2018 bill.
Thank you, Representative Vargas. Others? What's still before you in your respective states with respect to civics and implementation?
I'll jump in. I think, well, for us, it's also a discussion of how we improve the educational system overall. And we are dealing with here in Illinois some shortages in the classroom for teachers, and having a classroom, or having teachers who are going into the classroom prepared, but also who have diverse backgrounds and diverse perspectives, so that when they come into the classroom, they're comfortable teaching civics as a curriculum requirement, but also doing the work beyond just the requirement, because I think that's really where what you hear all of us talking about. The requirement's one thing. The investment in the experience is something very different. You could teach civics and go down, and as I think Representative Vargas mentioned earlier, you could memorize the preamble. Memorization and regurgitation is not learning. That's very different than understanding and taking the preamble to the Constitution and really understanding it, taking the history of our country in its totality, warts and all, and really understanding it. So for us, investing in recruiting individuals who are going to come into the profession of teaching, and we have some tremendous teachers who are doing some amazing things in the classroom, educators who are dedicated to their students, but making sure those pipelines continue, and that we have individuals who go into the classroom, prepare, and see civics education as a priority, because they know that they are creating those global citizens that our student talked about.
Thank you, Representative Senator Sims. When I first met you, Representative Sims. Representative Gambill, Chuck, any closing thoughts with respect to next steps in Georgia and Indiana?
Well, I just would say that the intentionality and the collaboration for civics education, they teach to what they test. And so often the funding follows that as well. And so I'm not even sure that we need a huge investment, although that would be great. I'm not even sure that we need that in Georgia, just to align resources and to be more intentional in our collaboration as it relates to civics education. I tell people all the time, vocational education never went away in our schools. Civics education never went away in our schools. We might have focused on other things. So how do we come back to the conversation as it relates to this civics education and put more emphasis there where it's being recognized and taught at a higher level? That's a big part of what I hope that we go with our Renewal Act here in Georgia.
Thank you, Representative Gambill. Chuck, bring us home.
Yeah, the last thing, and again, it's probably been touched on a lot of what my colleagues on the panel have said, but one of the things that we're looking at and that became clear to us in this process from teachers and hearing from teachers is really the need for professional development. And that's not just the teachers that are in the classroom, but it's the future teachers at the universities and colleges, and being able to give them the tools and resources to be able to teach civics. There is professional development, but it's not enough. And it's not getting out to all the teachers that need it. And so devoting resources to that is something that we're going to be focusing on as we move forward in our process as well.
Well, on behalf of all the folks that tuned in today, thank you, one, for spending an hour with us and preparing for today, but also from the bottom of my heart for your leadership on this issue. To everyone that's tuned in right now, go back to your email from today for day 2. We're going to join our plenary session. You don't want to miss this. We have the head of the Smithsonian and noted historian Lonnie Bunch and Ken Burns, fresh off the release of his documentary on Muhammad Ali. And they're going to weigh in on this issue, so you don't want to miss it. Thank you for leaning in today. I know we've had a rich conversation in the chat also, but delighted to spend the last hour with all of you. Thank you very much.